We now come to the backbench debate on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee report on a public inquiry into the government's response to the Covid-19 pandemic. Mr William Wragg is unable to participate today, so I call another member of the PACAC committee, Jackie Doyle-Price. I should advise the House that there will be a 3-minute limit on backbench speeches after the opening speech. Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a privilege to move this motion in the name of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee into the very important subject of the government's response to the Covid-19 pandemic and the promised public inquiry. We, as a committee, have taken evidence from actually some very well-informed help, if I could put it that way, and we brought our deliberations forward in the report under discussion today. We'd like to thank our witnesses who gave evidence, Emma Norris from the Institute for Government, Dr Alistair Stark from the University of Queensland, Jason Beer QC, Lord Butler of Brockwell, Sir Robert Francis QC, Dame Una O'Brien and Baroness Prashar of Runnymede, and all those who submitted written evidence to the inquiry. And I'd also like to thank fellow committee members for their well-informed deliberation on these matters. Now, we're all used now, I think, to public inquiries having become a routine part of the UK political landscape. And it's quite clear that the issues we've been grappling with for the last 18 months and the very difficult measures the government have taken to combat this pandemic are very much the right subject for a public inquiry. But whilst we are used to having such inquiries, there is very little guidance about how inquiries should be established, how chairs should be appointed and how terms of reference should be decided. So in the absence of such guidance, our committee has happily stepped into that void as a way of taking this discussion forwards. Now, the Prime Minister has committed in principle to establishing an inquiry, and in May of this year he suggested that it should be established in spring 2022. And I think the first message that the committee would like to give is that that timetable really ought to be brought forward for the simple reason that there is the establishment of the committee, but it takes some number of months before the inquiry can get underway in terms of establishing its secretariat and all the other functions that needed to be undertaken. And I guess one of the issues that we felt we were very keen to grapple with was that clearly the further away from events that inquiry is established, the less we can learn in a timely fashion. So we'd really like to encourage the government to think about how it will be setting up that inquiry from now, really, and it shouldn't really get in the way of the actual fight against the pandemic, particularly given where we are with regard to the vaccination. Clearly, we need to be very sure about what the purpose is of the inquiry, and I think we as a committee were very keen to make sure that the inquiry should be about learning lessons. It should not be about apportioning blame. The facts of the matter are that the government and all our public services for that matter we're dealing with unprecedented challenges, and there can be no right or wrong answers when the evidence on which you can make decisions is actually changing before your very eyes on a very day-to-day basis. Ultimately, it will come down to a matter of judgment exercised at the time, and I really hope that we can go into this inquiry very much in that spirit, because although I haven't agreed with every aspect of the government's decision-making on this matter, I absolutely recognise that everybody involved in this process was doing so honourably with the best of intentions. And we are not going to be honest about lessons learned unless we can approach this inquiry on that basis. And I think we in this place need to give some very clear messages about that and about how we are doing so in the spirit of learning. Yes, of course.
I've read the committee's report and would commend them for a very thoughtful and thorough report. And I listened carefully to what she just said, which is indeed one of the recommendations. And I understand learning lessons. That is often what committees do. I would challenge any member, particularly members who've been in this House for a long time, to remember the lessons learned and recommendations from the mad cow disease inquiry. My guess is nobody will. We already know that there are heroes and villains over the last 18 months, and I would hope that any inquiry would identify those heroes and villains. Mistakes have been made in some cases because mistakes were bound to be made, but some mistakes have been made willfully, and we need to know who were responsible for those mistakes.
Doyle-Price.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and clearly where there is willful bad behaviour, it should be exposed. But I think we really need to sort of set the tone that this inquiry is about how the government has dealt, and society has dealt with a very difficult set of issues. The heroes and villains to whom he describes will find a way of being outed, if I can put it in such a way, without it being the entire focus or ethos of the inquiry. We obviously need to be very clear about terms of reference for the inquiry and to really inform what will be the focus and how the various themes that could be looked at will be examined. The chair will obviously be a very important appointment, and clearly this is by tradition at the choice of the minister, but again I think the respect and authority of the inquiry is very much set by who the chair is, and I think as a committee we were very attracted to a chairman and panel approach, recognising that some of the issues that will be considered by the inquiry are quite broad-ranging, so it would be appropriate for the chairman to have access to appropriate expertise in various areas. And the committee also felt that the appointment should be subject to a pre-commencement hearing with the relevant select committee, given the very high levels of parliamentary interest in this inquiry. Now that would be actually an unprecedented step, but again, in terms of setting the tone of how the inquiry will be progressed, it could be a very important innovation. I really do hope that the government will consider that. I mean, in respect of the various issues that need to be considered by the inquiry, there is, of course, the response by the Department of Health in terms of management of risk of transmission and so on. But we do need to consider in the round the tools adopted by the government to deal with that, including the impact on liberties and the impact on our economy, because there will be obvious consequences longer term for the nation's well-being in the round. And we also need to consider the wider behaviour of public services in that regard too. There also needs to be a way of considering the impacts in the devolved nations as well, and consideration needs to be taken as to whether it should be a UK-wide one or separate inquiries, quite possibly a combination of both. Yes, of course.
Just to clarify, will the committee also be considering in the report whether any ministerial codes have been broken, whether it be by deliberately misleading the House or by other actions?
I would clearly expect any inquiry to consider such matters, but there are, of course, other ways of bringing complaints forward about breach of the ministerial code, and any action taken by those is, of course, a matter for the Prime Minister. As I mentioned, in taking forward the public inquiry, we must work on the basis that everyone did do their best, making decisions based on information known at the time. I would expect an inquiry to consider whether the impact of policy interventions on individual liberties were proportionate and whether they were effective. I think we really do need examination of the tools employed and whether they were effective in delivering the outcome intended. For example, we had a whole programme of local lockdowns, as you will be well aware of, Madam Deputy Speaker, but whether it was a legitimate tool to close down legitimate business activity when the areas of mass infection were ones where there was dense housing density and multi-generational households, was that the right tool? Again, we need to have some consideration of that to make sure that the government have properly assessed the balance between economic harm, liberty and health. Any inquiry, I would imagine, will find that development and deployment of vaccines has been an unqualified triumph, and in terms of lessons learned, we need to learn good lessons as well as things that didn't go quite as well as they should have done. I think we need a proper examination into how test, track and trace took so long to get off the ground, because that really wasn't an unqualified success, and we need to consider whether the balance was right between the centre and local government. And I think we also need to consider the issues around the supply of PPE, because having reacted to the suggestion that there was huge shortages, the fact of the matter is we now have massive stockpiles, and there are considerable costs to the taxpayer of maintaining those stockpiles. So again, we need to really properly consider how those decisions came to be made. And finally, I'd just like to invite the House and the government to consider the reflections of Bishop James Jones following his distinguished chairmanship of the Hillsborough inquiry, when he talked about the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. Now, I think that phrase is a very convenient way of expressing how institutions of the state can often operate to protect their own reputations at the expense of the public who they are meant to serve. And I think this is a really important principle to consider, given that the inquiry will be judging not just lives lost, but also the impact on businesses, jobs, and the wider impact on health and the harm that's also being caused by by the decisions of the last year, even though they were perhaps the best decisions that could have been made. And I think it's a behaviour that public institutions can fall into unless we in Parliament give them proper challenge. And perhaps one of the lessons we need to also learn about the last year is that quite often Parliament has not played its full role in scrutinising decisions made by the government. We've often been asked to give retrospective authority to decisions taken. And I think we all would like, I hope we would all share the view that parliamentary scrutiny actually makes for better decision making. And I'd just like to leave the final thought is that our liberties are not in the gift of government. They are ours. And it really does rest on consent given by Parliament on behalf of the public to ensure that those liberties, when we do surrender them, as we have in the last year, are not taken for granted by government. And I think in that regard, considering the behaviour of all our state institutions over this year is a very important scrutiny that the new inquiry would have to consider in order to make sure that the shift towards state power we've witnessed over the last year is not one that becomes permanent.
The question is, as on the order paper. Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to focus my comments on